to our workshop this evening. Oh, there we go. We are recording. This is our second educational workshop that we are holding for this phase of our general plan update. Right now, we are looking at our land use and circulation alternatives. We recently published our alternatives evaluation, which compares our three alternatives under a number of different metrics, which we will get into more detail this evening. Myself, I am Zach Dahl, Deputy Director with the City of San Mateo's Community Development Department. And then we also have a number of our team from PlaceWorks here tonight as we go through this effort. So we look forward to dialoguing with you. Also, as we're going through these, think about the land use alternatives in particular, but all of these as it's not an A, B, or C option. Think about different facets, pieces depending on the area of the city that might focus in best. And feel free to ask clarifying questions. We want to have a robust dialogue here in this virtual setting. So we look forward to hearing from you both tonight and further on as we move through the general plan update process. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Joanna, who's going to walk us through our presentations for tonight's event.
Thank you so much, Zach, much appreciated. Let me take just a moment and share my screen with you all. I'm going to start off with just a quick overview of tonight. We've just done our welcome and introductions, and in just a moment we're going to do a quick icebreaker poll to find out who's here tonight and maybe who's not here, who we're missing. And then we're going to give you kind of a presentation and Q&A and some chances to share in two different parts. First, I'm going to start off with an overview of the general plan and the land use alternatives and the circulation alternatives, and then give you a chance to ask some questions and also to respond to some questions through some interactive polling. And then we're going to come back to the presentation, and I will dive into a little bit more detail about the alternatives evaluation, and I'll explain what that is, and give you another chance to ask questions and answers, get answers, and do another round of interactive polling so that we can also hear from you. We're shooting to wrap up those two phases of this informational meeting by about 8 p.m. tonight. And then we're going to stay for another 30 minutes or so after that for additional Q&A or dialogue if there are folks who are interested in doing that. That's entirely optional, but we had some interest when we did this similar meeting on Saturday, and so we want to offer that opportunity tonight as well. So now that we've had a few minutes to gather and orient you a little bit to the meeting tonight, I am going to stop sharing, and we're going to launch an interactive poll in the Zoom platform that you'll see come up on your screen. And we're just asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself, just two quick questions. We're very interested to know whether or not this is your first time joining us for a general plan event. And also a little bit more about how you would describe yourself as a stakeholder in the general plan process. Whether you're a resident, whether you rent, work here, own a business here, or other kind of property, customer at San Mateo businesses, maybe you represent an organization. So we've learned throughout the general plan update that there are many different types of very engaged folks that are members of the San Mateo community. And it really helps us understand, again, who we're reaching and also who we need to improve our efforts to reach. So we really appreciate all of you for taking a few seconds and giving us a sense of this. Just to be clear, the consultant team and city staff are not responding to this poll. So really this is just to help us understand who's here from the community.
We have about 30 of 37 so far, Joanna.
Great, thank you, Ricky. I really appreciate everyone who's participating and willing to share a little bit. So far, it looks like a few more people have been to a general plan event than have not, but we still have quite a few people who are here for their first general plan meeting. And to those of you who are new, I want to extend a very special and a heartfelt welcome. Thank you so much. Throughout this process, we are always looking to add new people and new voices, and we're really grateful to you for joining us this evening. In terms of who else is here, most people are San Mateo residents, almost 80%. We've got some people who are renters and people who work here, about 4 people who rent, 4 people who work here, 5 people who own a business here. Many of you, about 50%, own property in San Mateo, and some are also a visitor to San Mateo businesses, which is great. And we have just a few people who identify themselves as representatives of neighborhood organizations or other types of organizations. So we can go ahead and close that polling, but again, just helps us to get a real quick sense of who's in the room and who we're speaking with, and that helps me too to kind of calibrate the information and the level of detail in the presentation. So thank you all very much, much appreciated. Let's go ahead and then we can close the poll and I will go back to the presentation and we'll keep moving right along. Make sure I'm getting that off. Okay. So we wanted to start by just making sure we share our goals today. We want to provide an inclusive and informed dialogue about potential future changes in San Mateo, develop a shared sense of possibility about that future, inform you about the outcomes of the alternatives evaluation, get some of your initial feedback on a preferred scenario in reaction to that information, and also help you leave with an understanding that this is just one step and one source of input into a much larger and longer process that has been going on for a couple of years now and still has a couple of years more or less to go. So throughout this presentation, as questions arise for you, please feel free to go ahead and put those in the chat for us. I would really ask that you send them specifically to Project Questions Carrie. Carrie is going to help keep track of all of our questions and make sure that that they all get received so we have a chance to respond to them. If you send them to me or someone else, we all have our own roles to do in the meeting and we might miss it and we don't want that to happen. So please send it to Project Questions Carrie. This screen shows you how you can do that by accessing the chat window through the little button at the bottom, the little kind of dialogue button at the bottom of your screen. And if you're on a smartphone, you can do that with the 3 dots button and then type in your message. And we're going to have 2 different parts of Q&A in this meeting where we'll start to go through those questions and then the optional 30 minutes at the end to catch up on anything that we didn't get to during the workshop itself. But you can submit your questions at any time. So let's start by talking about what is the general plan itself. The general plan is a very powerful document because it guides and regulates growth and development in San Mateo. The elements of the general plan cover a wide variety of topics like land use and circulation, which in this case means transportation and how we get around and move around, housing, urban design, open space, parks, safety, a lot of really important topics. The general plan sets the overarching direction on those topics, and then further detail is provided in things like specific plans, which add additional regulation and guidance for specific parts of the city, and the city's zoning code, which provides much more detail about exactly how buildings can look, how much parking is required, where entrances and exits have to be, lighting, trash enclosures, all those kinds of very specific details that apply to a given site. But the general plan is the place where those foundational decisions about what's going to get built where begin, and that's why it's so important. The general plan is guided by a vision statement and values that were developed with extensive community input. It says that San Mateo will be a vibrant, livable, diverse, and healthy community that respects the quality of its neighborhoods, fosters a flourishing economy, is committed to equity, and is a leader in environmental sustainability. And in support of that vision statement, The council also approved the 5 values of diversity, balance, inclusivity, prosperity, and resiliency. So this is the vision and values that is guiding our work throughout the general plan process. Let me tell you a little bit about where we are in that process. The general plan is shown on the top orange or golden bar on this schedule. So we're in the phase, we've just recently completed finalizing the draft alternatives earlier in 2021. Some of you might have helped us in those meetings. And we are now, we have evaluated those alternatives, and we're now in the midst of a process to use that information to create a preferred scenario based on feedback from the community and other input. We're then going to add to that the draft goals, policies, and actions that will make up kind of the meat of the general plan, package that all together in a draft general plan, an accompanying environmental impact report or EIR. Those things will be again circulated for public review and comment and set us up for adoption of the general plan by the end of 2023. This is happening all in parallel with another very important and related effort that you might have heard of called the housing element, and that's shown on the green bar on the bottom of this screen. So the housing element is a legally required chapter or element of the general plan, and it specifically focuses on providing housing for households at all income levels in San Mateo. The housing element is on a separate timeline because it has to meet very specific state deadlines. And it's the only element of the general plan that has to get reviewed and certified by the state. That has to happen no later than January 2023. So we're working closely with the housing element team to make sure that we're sharing information and that the two processes are staying consistent, even though they have to happen on different timelines. To date, we've gotten a lot of very valuable input. We have spoken to and collected feedback from literally thousands of San Mateo residents over the past few years, and those voices have been extremely important in shaping where we are today. We've heard consistently that people are concerned about traffic congestion and traffic safety, the need for affordable housing, the desire to see some improvements to transit in San Mateo, as well as improvements to sidewalks and crosswalks and lighting to make it safer to walk and bike in San Mateo, concern about the amount and availability of on-street parking, and the importance of community events and community spaces like San Mateo's parks to maintain social cohesion and serve as a center of community life in San Mateo. These things are all very important to people, and we've heard that loud and clear consistently throughout the process. So with that context, let me just turn quickly to the alternatives themselves that we're going to be talking about tonight. This is the general plan land use map, and the colors on this map correspond to what are called land use designations. And those designations determine what can be built and where and at what intensity, meaning the density or the height. So this map has a very strong role in saying what you might be able to build on your own property if you're a property owner, or what your neighbor or the person across the street can do with their property. So it's an extremely powerful and important map, and that's why we're spending so much time considering whether and how and where it should change as part of the general plan update. So to do that, we started by focusing on a set of study areas that are most likely to change over the course of this 20-year general plan. After a lot of conversation, the City Council gave us direction on the 10 study areas that you see outlined on this map. We then developed a range of alternatives for each one of those study areas, went through a community process to vet and finalize those alternatives, and now we have completed an evaluation and comparison of those alternatives. So now we're entering a phase of talking with the community and other decision makers to mix and match the ideas from these alternatives to create what we call a preferred scenario. That preferred scenario will then become the basis for updates to the general plan land use map that you saw on the previous slide, as well as changes to the planned transportation network in the general plan. So the 3 land use alternatives that we created have 3 different possible outcomes from the different land use categories that they consider for the study areas. Alternative A would include about 11,800 new homes above what's existing. Alternative B increases that by about 5,000 to add 16,000 new homes. And alternative C would add about 21,000 new homes. And of course, each of those then corresponds to an increased population based on the current population per household of San Mateo. All three alternatives would also add about 15,000 new jobs above what's in San Mateo today. So we have heard consistently throughout the process about the need, different opinions about the need for new housing in San Mateo. And that really seems to have been a primary concern for most people. So that's really the primary difference between the three alternatives, and something that we really wanted to be able to test with these different scenarios. One thing to understand about these alternatives, and here's how they look on the map, so that you can see from these different colors that they consider different types of land use categories or designations that would allow different types and intensities of uses within the study areas. That includes some heights that exceed the current height limits that are imposed by Measure Y. So if the ultimate preferred scenario includes heights that would exceed Measure Y, that's something that would have to be taken back before the voters, since that was a voter approved measure, limiting heights and densities in San Mateo. Areas that are outside of these study areas are covered by the general plan. The general plan covers the entire city of San Mateo, and areas that are outside of the study areas can and will see some change over the next 20 years. But the study areas are really the places, because they're closest to existing services, they're close to transit and transportation routes, and some of them include properties that might already be starting to transition to new uses, or where we've heard interest in transition. These are the places where we're focusing the alternatives effort. I mentioned the housing element earlier. How that shows up in the land use alternatives specifically is that the housing element, one of its requirements, one of many requirements from the state, is that the housing element has to identify sites to accommodate 7,015 units. And the city is also going to plan for a buffer over the next 8 years, from 2023 to 2031. Except for study area 1 North, which is the northern end of El Camino Real, all of the study areas have sites that have been identified in the housing element work as housing opportunity sites. And for our land use alternatives, all of those housing sites are designated as residential medium or residential high, or in some cases mixed use medium or mixed use high, so that they can allow multifamily housing consistent with what the housing element is identifying. And in addition, the housing element has a very important role in affirmatively furthering fair housing and ensuring that all residents of San Mateo have access to opportunity. So let me move to talking about the circulation alternatives that go along with the land use alternatives. We have 3 land use alternatives and 3 circulation alternatives. The circulation alternatives are not broken down by study area. They look at the city as a holistic citywide system. All of the alternatives, all of the circulation alternatives assume that pedestrian and bicycle improvements consistent with approved city plans would be made, and they could all be tailored to fit the ultimate preferred land use scenario. Circulation alternative A prioritizes a walkable city by adding pedestrian corridors, pedestrian improvements to challenging intersections, and implementing traffic calming, and safety improvements near highway on-ramps in particular. This alternative also envisions a two-block pedestrian only street downtown, consistent with current initiatives. Circulation alternative B would focus on transit and regional connections using transit, different modes of transit. So it would increase and improve transit access to major connections, including adding a new east-west transit connections to the Hillsdale Caltrain station, It would include prioritize dedicated high occupancy vehicle like carpool and bus lanes north-south along El Camino Real, including potential BRT or bus rapid transit improvements on El Camino Real. Circulation alternative C kind of combines the local and regional improvements in both alternatives A and B. It would be intended to create really a very pedestrian focused and car light space downtown. It could explore an autonomous vehicle shuttle or on-demand shuttle services or other future transportation technologies within city limits. The reason why alternative, when we talked about these alternatives in previous rounds of workshops, people said, this sounds great, we want it all. And I certainly understand that. But it's important to also understand that as we make choices about what modes or different ways of getting around to prioritize within San Mateo's existing roadways, those roadways right now are in many cases set up for the car and a single occupant driver as kind of the primary user. And if we want to say that instead the primary user of a given space might be a person on a bike or a person on a bus, then that would mean some trade-offs and some changes in the way that that roadway space is used. So it's important to understand that prioritizing other modes will also often come with, other than cars, will come with changes to the way that cars move around town. And we know that that is something very sensitive to consider. So with that, I've given you a little bit of background on the alternatives and on what the general plan is overall. So we're going to have some time now for a first round of questions and answers. Just a reminder, use the chat function to submit your questions, and you can send your questions to Project Questions Carrie. So as we start to do that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and let's see what we can answer.
All right, the first question was, and this was in response to our Zoom poll, I'm having difficulty with understanding your concept of resident. You say some residents and some renters. If we're here renting for 30 or more years, aren't we considered renters?
Yeah, absolutely. Renters are residents for sure. What we found is that when we ask just about residents, that we were not sure whether we were talking to renters and homeowners. And we've heard both from folks in the community, as well as from the city council, that it's really important to make sure that we're reaching renters in addition to reaching homeowners. And so that's why we like to ask about renters specifically, to find out how we're doing on that. But yes, absolutely, renters are residents, renters are stakeholders, renters have a voice in this process, and we welcome and encourage your participation, and I thank you for being here.
Right, our next question was, will future general plans always need to plan for increasing populations? Will there ever be a cap on population in San Mateo?
Great question. Requires me to tell the future in a way that's probably beyond my pay grade, but right now I can tell you that one of the reasons why general plans plan for increasing population is because the state is planning for increasing population. And the state, especially in recent years, has made housing that population a priority and addressing what is seen as an existing housing shortfall and a resulting housing affordability crisis in California, including in San Mateo, as a state priority. And therefore, the state is offering a lot of both carrots and sticks to cities right now to require them to plan for both increasing population and where to house that population. Do you want to add to that, Zach?
I think you answered it well, but yes, that right now, given where the city is and what the state is looking at to house and handle all the range of residents who live in the state, right now, planning for growth is something that the city has to do. And there are actually penalties from the state if the city is unwilling or unable to plan for at least the minimum, which is right now over the next 8-year cycle, that 7,000 housing unit number that Joanna mentioned earlier in the presentation.
I can tell you that other cities in the Bay Area that have had even voter-approved housing or population caps have had those struck down by the courts because of the overwhelming need for housing throughout California.
Okay, I have a couple questions about jobs and housing, so I'm going to read them together. How many jobs has San Mateo added over the last 20 years versus how many homes have they added? Curious about what kind of housing deficit the city might need to dig out of. And the second question was, Alternative C had more net increase in housing units, but less jobs. Is that because we currently have a large jobs to housing gap already?
Sure. Let me at least make a start on this. We have done a lot of research in earlier phases of this project about existing numbers of jobs and past numbers of jobs. So we have some existing conditions reports on the Strive San Mateo website. So strivesanmateo.org is the website for this general plan update. And it is a great resource and an archive of all of the reports that we've produced, the presentations we've given, the meetings we've held, the notes and surveys we've collected. Please check that out if you're interested in this process. And there are both economic and land use reports on that website that have more detail on the history of job growth in San Mateo, as well as housing growth. And so you can take a look and compare those two. I don't have those numbers memorized, I apologize. But we've definitely heard throughout the process that many people feel that there is a housing deficit and a jobs housing imbalance in San Mateo, and more jobs here than housing, which both increases the price of housing and causes greenhouse gas and other kinds of pollution as people have to drive into jobs in San Mateo because they can't afford to both live and work in San Mateo. So that's certainly a phenomenon that the alternatives evaluation takes a look at. And we do have a section on jobs housing balance. All of the three alternatives kind of held jobs constant at 15,000 new jobs. But when we put them together with existing jobs and housing that are already here on the ground, alternative A has more jobs than housing, and so kind of would continue to be likely to import workers. Alternative C and B are both pretty well balanced in terms of actually not their comparison of jobs to housing, but rather more specifically the comparison of jobs to employed residents. So the balance for both alternatives B and C was close to 1, slightly over 1 for alternative B, slightly under 1 for alternative C when we compared number of jobs to number of employed residents in the future.
And then just building on what Joanna said, I think it's important to understand we're planning for, but at the end of the day, property owners, market conditions, and a lot of other factors are going to ultimately dictate how this growth takes place. And so when we look at these land use alternatives or these land use categories, whether it's residential at varying densities, mixed use, or commercial, this is the city planning for and laying a blueprint for how growth can occur. But ultimately, there are other factors that will dictate how it comes out. And then the other thing, well, there is a lot of discussion around jobs housing balance. There's also other facets such as jobs housing fit and understanding, well, you may have an equal number of jobs or an appropriate ratio to jobs and housing. That doesn't mean that everyone that works here will live here. And by most of our studies, most of the people that work here don't live here. And conversely, most of the people that live here commute elsewhere for work. So there's a lot of other pieces that play into that that are outside of our control. And so there are pieces we can manage and plan for, and then other pieces that are driven by other forces at a larger level or that are affected by other factors.
Thank you, Zach.
Great. Our next question was, can there be a mix and match approach? I don't like the idea of pedestrian focused plan A of the circulation alternatives. Can there be the downtown shuttle added to plan B?
Yeah, great question. We talked about a mix and match approach for the alternatives that applies to both the land use alternatives and the circulation alternatives. And as we get a little bit farther along and start to ask for your feedback in the interactive polling, we definitely are interested to hear not only if there's a given alternative that you like, but especially if there's specific pieces of a given alternative that you would really like to see, or pieces that you really don't want included in the preferred scenario. So mix and matching is definitely allowed and encouraged.
You stated that the community is concerned about traffic congestion / traffic safety and lack of on-street parking. It wasn't clear from your description of the transportation alternatives how they address these issues, other than to promote the use of transit and high occupancy vehicles. Would you expand upon this item?
I am going to expand upon that item quite significantly in the second part of my presentation.
All right. Are you looking at an estimate of mode shift with these alternatives? Similarly, is one explicit goal to reduce VMT, vehicle miles traveled, not just as part of CEQA, but as part of an explicit goal?
Yes, I am going to, yes, we are looking at mode shift, and that's another thing that you'll see in the second part of the presentation. Mode shift means changing the way that people choose to get around. So people deciding to go from the mode of using a car to the mode of riding a bike or taking transit. And we did look at that in the evaluation. In terms of the goals of reducing VMT, if you remember the schedule that I showed, the next phase of this project is really starting to get more clarity on the goals and the policies and actions in the general plan. So we haven't defined specific goals yet, but the alternatives do look at comparison of VMT, and I'm going to show you some slides on that in the second part of the presentation. It's also worth noting here briefly that in terms of the city's goals, the city does have an adopted climate action plan that is specifically intended to reduce greenhouse gas or GHG emissions. And a very important way of doing that is by reducing vehicle miles traveled or VMT. So in that sense, the city does have some established and pretty quantified goals for reducing VMT and the related greenhouse gas emissions. And we're going to be building on the work of the adopted climate action plan and making sure that that's woven in throughout the general plan.
All right, there are terms I am not familiar with: medium and high residential. What does this mean?
Sure. Yes, and apologies to everyone because planning is a very much its own world with its own vocabulary. So we try to communicate these in clear and plain English terms. And I apologize when we do not always accomplish that. But some of the terms that we use are referring to what I call the land use categories or the land use designations that we used for the general plan, for the land use alternatives. And those refer to different residential categories, different densities specifically of the amount of residential development that would be allowed in that category. So the low density residential or residential low would be allow from 1 to 3 stories. Residential medium is from 4 to 8 stories, and residential high is above 8 stories. I think I have that close to right.
Right. A couple of questions on Measure Y. Which
Okay.
alternatives would conflict with Measure Y in terms of contemplated building heights? And which of the alternatives is consistent with Measure Y?
Sure. So alternative A is mostly consistent with Measure Y. Again, Measure Y is a voter approved measure that limits heights and densities in San Mateo. Alternative A is mostly consistent with Measure Y. Measure Y, as recently approved by the voters, also includes a sunset date of 2030. This general plan will go out beyond that date. So we did consider some alternatives that are not consistent with the current restrictions that are in place under Measure Y. So both alternatives B and C include heights in different study areas, that heights and densities that would exceed the limits of Measure Y. C has more of those heights and densities that are above the Measure Y limits than does alternative B.
Right. What is the process for picking between alternatives A, B, and C? I really like the walkable, bikeable city. There's a lot of traffic in San Mateo, so it prevents me from feeling comfortable biking. Are we looking at finding a safer way for biking?
Great. Well, first, let me just say again that all of the alternatives do assume the improvements that are in the city's recently adopted bicycle master plan. And so those improvements are kind of baked in already, regardless of what happens with the general plan, because that's part of an approved plan that would be carried forward. So certain types of improvements are already part of what the city is planning for. But in terms of mixing and matching with the circulation alternatives, we're going to be getting your input here tonight. We have an online survey that I'm going to be talking more about towards the end of the presentation that has also an opportunity to give feedback on which specific components of the alternatives you like or don't care for. And then we're going to be going through a series of meetings with these alternatives with the general plan subcommittee, the planning commission, and the city council, who are all going to be considering these kinds of pros and cons and trade-offs and mixing and matching to help us create the preferred scenario. So you'll have a chance at each one of those stages to add your voice about the components that appeal most to you or that cause you concern. Let's do one more question right now, Carrie, and then keep moving, because some of these questions are already showing me that people are excited to hear about the evaluation.
Sure. This last one was a question about the super block idea, and I'm wondering if you could expand upon it a bit more.
Sure. This is an idea that's been implemented in some places in Europe. Barcelona is probably one of the most well-known examples where a set of streets, kind of the interior of a block, is restricted from cars, not entirely cut off if you, but restricted from cars to really focus on being able to make the pedestrians the priority users in that space. So you might have streets or intersections that are closed off by planters, for example, and then you can do things like set up tables and chairs or landscaping more in those in the right of way that used to be the street used by cars. All right, thank you so much, Carrie. I appreciate that. I'm going to now I'm going to share my screen for a moment so that I can provide you guys with some instruction about how to do our interactive polling. We're going to be using a tool called Social Pinpoint. And this enables us to get real-time feedback from you. So on your screen right now, you should see a slide with a QR code, a little square, and also a URL. And we're also going to put both of these URLs in the chat. This will connect you to an English language poll or a Spanish language poll that's going to ask you a few questions, just a couple questions about your initial reactions or thoughts about circulation issues and land use issues in San Mateo. So you can hold up your smartphone to the screen and hold up, it will use the QR code to navigate you to that website, or you can use the link that Ricky put in the chat. And we're gonna, you're gonna arrive at a website that's gonna ask you a couple of questions. What's the most important circulation issue the general plan should help the city improve? And what's the most important land use issue the general plan should help the city improve? And you can answer those questions multiple times. You can answer one or both of those questions. And I'm going to stop sharing so that we can all take a look at Angelica's screen, who has this real-time poll pulled up. And we'll watch the responses as they come in. We're going to be doing another one of these in a second round of interactive polling. And we'll go through this again later. So just focusing on circulation, for the time being, it looks like most of our initial responses are about circulation. Reducing congestion and maintaining peak hour travel times is important. Abating traffic and improving bicycle safety is important. Safe bike routes for all different kinds of people who ride bikes. Again, traffic congestion and a lack of viable transit options, which of course, commenter is making the point that the city does not actually operate transit in San Mateo. That's operated through a separate agency called Samtrans. But of course, transit is very important and a really key factor in the general plan update and in being able to get around. So we took We've also gotten some input on some of the land use issues. People need homes. We've been hearing that consistently. Maintain single family neighborhoods as much as possible. Connecting circulation to land use and specifically the effects of housing on traffic, definitely important, something we're going to talk more about in the second part of the presentation. The general plan should add at least 14,000 more homes than new jobs. Focus and maximize density around transit, new housing around transit. Great, let's see if we have any other new comments coming in. Angelica, thank you. All right, some skepticism about a pedestrian-friendly option as being not realistic. People need their cars to commute and take their kids to school and extracurricular events. Traffic is the most important circulation issue, and congested intersections are the worst problems in San Mateo. Again, comments about congestion and safety, more walkable, more bikeable, more beautiful. Some folks feel that right now it is dangerous to get around San Mateo by bike and foot and in wheelchairs, and that there's really a lack of transit, kind of both frequency and coverage. So it's hard to get people out of cars. Less emphasis on cars, more emphasis on alternative transportation or walkability. People are angry when they're on the roads, maybe because of all this congestion. All right. And we've got some responses coming in under our Spanish language survey too. These are in English, but we appreciate it. Promoting public transportation, shifting from a car-centric city to a multimodal one. Very good, thank you for that. Any more responses coming in? Great, you can leave them both on. Angelica, that's fine. All right, we'll focus on land use. Need a lot more affordable housing. More housing in high opportunity neighborhoods, concern about preventing 1980s style pedestrian mall failures, affordable housing for young families to stay local. A lot of people are suggesting more affordable housing or more housing in general. Other people say too much housing development or too many new homes. Folks are interested in protecting downtown to preserve the successful mix of medium and small businesses and to protect all single family neighborhoods. Concerned about restrictive height and density limits, desire for transit supportive land uses. So I feel like this is just giving you and certainly us a really good flavor of the diversity of viewpoints in San Mateo that we've been hearing throughout the general plan update process. So you can see what your neighbors and fellow San Mateo stakeholders are concerned about and some of their ideas for how we might address these very pressing land use and circulation issues. So thank you so much for taking a few minutes to share those ideas with us on the social pinpoint tool. We really appreciate that. That helps us understand your thoughts, and those are very important for us as we continue to shape this process. So let me go into a little bit more detail now about the alternatives evaluation. I know while some of you are having your very first general plan meeting tonight, others of you have been with us for past discussions and you're interested in getting into some of the more in-depth work of the evaluation. So over the past few months, we have been analyzing the land use and circulation alternatives that you saw and comparing them across the topics that are listed here on this slide. We focused on these topics because this is what we heard was important to the community. And we tried to think about kind of the potential outcomes and the pros and cons for these topics, including height and density, jobs housing balance, which we've already talked about a little bit tonight, impacts on historic resources, how the traffic and multimodal network will function under these alternatives, the ability to provide community services and utilities to the city, specifically water, wastewater, and stormwater, how the alternatives might interact with environmental sustainability issues, especially sea level rise, flooding and wildfire risk, equity and public health outcomes, fiscal sustainability and impacts on the city's operating budget, the market feasibility of different development types that are considered under these land use alternatives, and the potential for community benefits from the alternatives. So we looked at each one of these topics in the alternatives evaluation, and the full evaluation is posted on strivesanmateo.org. You can see that web address on every one of our slides. So the whole evaluation is available. I'm just going to kind of summarize it and give you some high-level conclusions tonight. The evaluation does not score or rank the alternatives on these topics. And that's because, as you can tell from the interactive polling that we just saw, different things are pros and cons to different people. So while one person might argue that providing more housing and meeting future regional housing needs allocations is a pro of a given alternative, that might not be appealing to other people. So the alternatives evaluation presents the analysis, and some of it is very quantitative analysis, but it's really up to you to draw your own conclusion about the implications of these different outcomes and what you want to move towards or away from. So let's start by looking at the evaluation of the circulation alternatives. All of the circulation alternatives saw the biggest benefit when paired with land use alternative C. And specifically, when we paired circulation alternative C with land use alternative C, that made the biggest difference in shifting people out of their cars to walk, bike, or take transit. This question came up earlier in the Q&A. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a couple more slides. I've already mentioned when we think about the pedestrian network specifically, I've already mentioned that all of the alternatives include adopted city, bicycle, and pedestrian plans. Circulation alternative B, because it prioritizes the transit improvements, it includes the fewest additional pedestrian improvements. And whereas circulation alternative C has the highest pedestrian benefit because it includes the same pedestrian realm improvements from alternative A, but adds additional downtown traffic calming. When we turn to the bicycle network and the transit network, circulation alternatives A and C had the most benefit for bicycles because of improvements along El Camino Real. And circulation alternatives B and C had the most transit benefit because they increased transit coverage and especially east-west linkages. And they also improved transit service up and down El Camino Real. So let's take a look at vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. We've already got at least one question about this. So here's some of the quantitative information that you're asking about. VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, is a measure of the total number of miles driven per day by people who travel to or from San Mateo in this case. So any trips that either start in or end in San Mateo, or do both, are included in this analysis. And so what that also means is that the full length of that trip is reflected in this analysis. So if I live way out in the Central Valley and I commute into San Mateo to work, then I drive a lot of vehicle miles, much more than if I live in Belmont and drive to San Mateo for work. So this includes the number of trips and the distance of trips for all different kinds of trips, not only for work, as in my example, but for shopping, to take kids to school, for any reason. So typically you see that areas that have a diverse mix of uses and also have facilities that allow people to choose not to drive will generally have a lower vehicle miles traveled than areas where land uses are more distinct and segregated. So you can see on this slide that land use alternative A would result in the lowest total vehicle miles traveled. So that's the 3.3 million number here, total VMT for alternative A. And alternative C would generate the greatest total VMT at 3.5 million. But when we look over here at the VMT per capita or per person, land use alternative A has the highest amount of VMT per person, and land use alternative C has the lowest amount of VMT when we look at it on a per person basis. It's important to note that all of the alternatives are an improvement over the existing VMT per capita of 16.5, although they do increase, they all increase the total VMT. But in general, this indicates to us that since the land use alternatives, any of the land use alternatives, but especially alternatives B and C would add more housing and jobs near transit, but they would also increase the number of people driving in San Mateo. More people would be likely to choose to travel by transit, walking, and bicycling because there would be increased access to those choices and be able to avoid roadway congestion compared to current conditions in 2019. So then VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, really gives us a very regional picture of how the choices that San Mateo makes affect travel at a large scale. But in addition, it's important to understand how local roadways might function under the different alternatives. So we also looked at average speeds in San Mateo in 2040 under all three of the alternatives. So the average speed of the roadway system indicates kind of how the road network is going to respond to the land use and the circulation alternatives. This is the average daily 24-hour and peak hour speeds on the roadway segments in San Mateo that are part of the kind of computer model of the city's travel network. So as we would expect, but all of the alternatives add housing and add jobs. So there would be more people in San Mateo in 2040 under all three of the alternatives. And that translates into a decrease in average speeds when we look across the entire roadway system. So this isn't about an individual roadway or an individual intersection, but looking at the roadway network as a whole. Land use alternative A would have higher average speeds in both the AM and PM peak hour than B or C, and C would have, C and B are really pretty close together. B is slightly lower in the mornings, and C is slightly lower in the PM peak hour. But overall, all of for both the daily and AM and PM peak hours, all alternatives would decrease average speeds on roadways because there's going to be more people driving on the roadways, even though it's also true that more people will be taking other modes like transit, bicycling, and walking. The general overall increase translates into the average speeds that you see on this slide. So then, well, that's a little bit about the circulation alternatives. And again, the evaluation has more on all of these topics. But let's look at the land use alternatives and what we found when we started to compare those. First of all, in many of the topics that I shouldn't say many, several of the topics that we looked at, there were pretty similar outcomes among the three land use alternatives, even though they have some pretty important differences. There's some topics for which those differences really don't affect a distinct outcome for the land use alternatives. So when we looked at the wastewater system and the stormwater system, we think that with some changes, those systems could both accommodate the development under any one of the three land use alternatives. Similarly, when we look at sea level rise and flooding, all of the alternatives have the potential to add development in areas that are subject to sea level rise or to flooding, and therefore their impacts would be similar. Study area 6 over on the west side of San Mateo, up by the Laurelwood Shopping Center, that's the area of San Mateo that is closest to high wildfire risk areas. None of the study areas are in a very high wildfire hazard severity zone, but study area 6 is the closest, and all three alternatives contemplate some increase in development there. So they would have similar outcomes. Similarly, potential future parkland shortage would occur under all three of the alternatives. All three alternatives would probably not have a strong influence one way or the other on reducing collisions in San Mateo. And that's because the research shows that collision reduction is really primarily a factor of roadway design and vehicle speeds and other factors that are not necessarily strongly or directly influenced by land use. And then finally, all three alternatives would offer at least some potential to capture community benefits, meaning developers offering amenities or other kinds of benefits to the city as part of their development agreement for their individual project, depending on the policies that the city would want to put in place around that process. So those topics kind of have similar outcomes among the land use alternatives, but we did see some important differences among the land use alternatives. So I'm going to go through those kind of by each alternative. Alternative A, as you know, has the least amount of residential growth and it has the lowest densities and heights. For that reason, it is the least likely of the alternatives to meet future housing allocations from the state beyond 2031. So your current housing element is planning for an 8-year cycle that will go from 2023 to 2031. Near the end of that cycle, we would anticipate, if current state law continues to operate the way that it has for the past 60 or so years, that you would get an additional housing allocation for the next 8-year cycle. And alternative A doesn't really provide the capacity that would be needed to show that San Mateo can meet that state requirement. So the city would be needing to come back to the community and help figure out where to accommodate additional housing beyond 2031. Alternative A, as I mentioned earlier, has slightly more jobs than residents. So we would expect to continue to see just on the employed residents. So as Zach noted, there's many factors that go into jobs housing balance, but in general, when we see a place that has more jobs than employed residents, that tends to mean that folks have to commute in to work. Total VMT, as we saw on the other slides, would be the lowest, but per capita VMT would be the highest. Alternative A makes the fewest changes within the downtown historic district. And it would require the least change to add police, fire, schools, parks, and library services. Because it has the least amount of total residential growth, it would also be expected to generate the fewest affordable housing units. Right now, San Mateo has requirements that a certain percentage of new residential growth has to be dedicated to affordable housing units. And so when you have less total growth, you have less affordable housing growth as well. And alternative A, we looked at the fiscal impact on the city for all of the alternatives and the net annual operating budget of the city. And alternative A would have the lowest revenues for the city, but it would also have the lowest costs. And so therefore it resulted in the largest projected annual net fiscal surplus. All of the alternatives did show a fiscal surplus, but alternative A shows the largest. When we look at alternative B, this kind of has the medium amount of residential growth, about 16,000 new homes as compared to alternative A having 11,000 and alternative C having 21,000. So alternatives B is in the middle with about 16,000 new homes. It spreads densities and heights across, increases in densities and heights across the study areas. That enables it to have a greater likelihood of meeting future housing allocations beyond 2031, but it doesn't leave a lot of room in there. Medium densities that are the medium residential densities that are in kind of that 4 to 7 story range or 4 to 8 story range that I talked about earlier are kind of a good fit for current market conditions, and the development type, alternative B has the most amount of development types that are most likely to be feasible under today's market conditions. Alternative B, as I mentioned, has a relative balance between jobs and employed residents. It has more total VMT than alternative A. but a higher VMT per capita than alternative C. Alternative B would allow the greatest amount of change in the downtown historic district specifically. And then it's kind of in the middle of a lot of the other topics that we looked at. So mid-range in terms of the degree of change that would be needed to add police, fire, schools, parks, and library services. Middle of the range in the number of alternative housing, affordable housing units that it would provide, and middle of the range in terms of generating an annual net fiscal surplus. And then finally, alternative C, land use alternative C, has the highest amount of residential growth, over 21,000 new homes, in addition to the 15,000 new jobs. It would allow the highest heights and densities, especially concentrated around existing Caltrain stations. For this reason, it would be the most likely to meet future state housing allocation requirements beyond 2031 and enable the city to adopt future housing elements without needing to revisit land use decisions. We saw that the total VMT under alternative C is the highest, and its per capita VMT is the lowest. Alternative C also has a relative balance between jobs and employed residents. Because it adds the most new residents, it would require the most change to be able to add police, fire, schools, parks, and library services to serve those future residents. Because it would have the greatest amount of new residential development, it would also be most likely to have the most amount of new affordable housing units. It would also have the highest revenues and the highest costs. So therefore, it is projected to generate the smallest net fiscal surplus while still being positive. And some of the development types under alternative C, when we start to look at those buildings that allow 8 stories or above in the high designations, residential high, mixed use high, office high, especially because of the amount of parking that is required for buildings with of that size, with that many residents or that many workers, the amount of parking goes up along with that. And then it becomes often would trigger a requirement to provide that parking in a parking structure or an underground parking that's built into the building. And in addition, those taller buildings have to have very specific types of life safety measures, fire sprinklers and building materials. And all of this adds up to a pretty high price of construction for those taller buildings. So at the moment, those taller buildings across these different types of development under current market conditions are less likely to pencil out and be feasible. So the alternative B kind of mid-range heights are about where the market's at right now. Not quite there for alternative C. And at this time, it's certainly possible that in the 20-year life of the general plan, we could see that market change and make those taller building heights more feasible. So in addition to the evaluation, I just wanted to let you know that there's one other way that you can envision and compare the alternatives. We have an online tool, and again, this is available at strivesanmateo.org, that shows the potential height and massing that could be allowed in the different under the different alternatives within selected parts of the study areas. So these shapes represent the range of possible heights and intensities that could be proposed under each alternative. The different colors of the shapes that you see here represent the different land use categories and the building types. So residential is orange, mixed use is blue, public structures are green, all the white buildings are existing buildings. And I just want to make sure that I'm really clear, none of these alternatives, of course, have been adopted. This is going to be, we're still many steps away from that. No development projects have been proposed. We did try to reflect any projects that are already approved, if we're aware of those. But the shapes that you see in the online model are not actual buildings. They don't represent specific development proposals. They're really kind of an imaginary way to envision the envelope of what might be allowed. Doesn't mean what would be built, but what would be allowed. And within the model, if you go there, you can use your mouse or your trackpad to move around in the within the tool, and you can change your vantage point and look at the different alternatives from different angles and perspectives. So again, if you're interested in checking that out, please go to strivesanmateo.org. And with that, we are on to our second round of questions and answers. So one more reminder, use the chat function, send your questions to Project Questions Carrie, and we'll take a few minutes to answer some more questions, and then we have another interactive poll for you.
All right. Please explain more about how VMT was measured. Is it just VMT in the city or the entire trip length, including portions outside of San Mateo? Is it annual VMT, daily weekday VMT, peak hour VMT? Is it VMT based on a traffic model? Can the model be confirmed? Can you really estimate VMT down to the nearest mile?
Sure. So the traffic model is, when we say the traffic model, that refers to a kind of computer simulation of San Mateo's roadway network. And the computer simulation or traffic model that the city uses is tailored to the city, and then it's kind of embedded in a larger regional model that is maintained by the City County Association of Governments of San Mateo County that includes a larger roadway network and development assumptions for land outside of the city of San Mateo, and in turn within both the 9-county Bay Area and even regions that are beyond the Bay Area. So the answer to your question is that we do look at the full trip length. So any trip that begins or ends in San Mateo is part of what's captured here. So even if it comes from outside of the city, the full length of the trip is what's reflected. And I totally understand the questions about the traffic model. Traffic models can be certainly very daunting for those of us who are not professional traffic engineers, which I am not. But they are the best tool that we have for trying to predict and understand how transportation patterns would be affected and different interactions between land use and transportation. I'm sure that there's different assumptions that can be plugged into every analysis and every traffic model, but this is consistent with what's used across the city for planning efforts.
All right, a few more VMT questions. Did you look at how much VMT is generated by the people in alternative A who would have been able to live in San Mateo had we selected alternatives B and C? And what would the VMT for the no build or do nothing alternative be like?
Great questions. So as I said, the VMT for this analysis looks at any trip that begins or ends in San Mateo. So for trips that don't begin and that includes people who are driving into San Mateo right now because they work in San Mateo or because they want to shop in San Mateo, but they might have to drive in from a long way away because San Mateo is expensive to live in and they can't afford to live there. So if that person is traveling to San Mateo for some reason, then we captured that trip and we captured the full distance of it. If that person does not live in San Mateo right now and they're not coming to San Mateo because they don't work in San Mateo or shop here, then that trip's not part of the numbers that I showed you. So people who would like to live in San Mateo but actually don't come there, do not travel to San Mateo right now, are not captured. But people who work in San Mateo and live elsewhere are captured. I hope that answers the question. We did not model the existing general plan. I think that would come closest to what you call the do nothing alternative. But we do have data on existing VMT. That was part of what I showed.
All right, several questions on average speeds. Doesn't lower average speeds mean more congestion? Are these average speeds citywide? If citywide, then an average of 10.8 suggests that some busy streets are hardly moving since many streets are lightly used and serve very little traffic. And lastly, by looking at the average speed decreases for all three alternatives, it makes me wonder why more isn't being considered to help address the traffic impacts of all these extra residents in our city.
Yeah, so the average speed is citywide on all of the roadways that are part of the city's traffic model that I was talking about a second ago. So that is a single number that represents many streets. So yes, because it's an average, that means that some streets would be below that and some streets would be above that. That's exactly right. And in terms of more being done to address the traffic congestion, we definitely are trying to be as creative as possible in alternatives, in the circulation alternatives, and very much remain open to additional ideas to explore. The adding, even with the addition of those creative ideas, whether that's exploring a on-demand shuttle or bus rapid transit lanes. We are looking, as you can tell, at adding quite a bit of housing and jobs to San Mateo under any of the three alternatives, and that translates into these average speed outcomes that we showed you. Go ahead, Zach.
Perfect. Well, I just wanted to build on that and also note that the assumptions that are going into this are based on the conditions as they exist now and building upon those. But obviously looking into the future, things like remote work, other ways that people are not driving could account for shifts. So this is working with the data we have, knowing that any number of conditions could change moving into the future, and with the goal that as we improve alternative modes, that makes it more feasible and practical for people that are living here and working here to use those in lieu of the car. So we're working with the data we have now, but a lot of these other elements of what we're planning for hopefully will influence that to avoid just a pure traffic goes up as growth goes up.
Thank you.
All right. Does the net fiscal surplus include costs for police, fire, schools, parks, and libraries?
Sure. Short answer is yes. The net fiscal surplus is about the city's annual operating budget. So it doesn't include things like capital improvements, but it does include day-to-day operations like police services. Schools, just out of that list, are not provided by the city. They're of course provided by your local school districts. And so that's not part of the city's fiscal budget, but those other services that you listed are part of the fiscal analysis.
Right, several questions about parking. Are we considering parking policy changes to make those taller buildings in alternative C feasible? Can parking just not be allowed for the employers bringing more people to San Mateo? Can the general plan process consider reducing or ideally eliminating the parking requirements that contribute to higher density housing, not penciling out for developers?
Sure. So yeah, as we noted, we know that parking is something that people in San Mateo think about a lot. Throughout the process, we've heard about that. What I can say in terms of is that the questions you're asking are really about policy, and policy is coming in the next phase of this project. However, most communities that I have worked in really address parking policy when we get down to the zoning code level. So you saw in one of the very first slides in the presentation that the general plan is kind of very big picture and sets the direction for the city, and then that's further implemented with much more detail in other documents, a very important one of which is the zoning code. That is also a separate document. So that's the place where specific parking standards for different types of uses live. So how many parking spaces does a hotel have to have versus a nail salon versus an office building versus a single family home or an apartment building? That level of detail is really not in most general plans for most cities. However, the general plan can be the place of establishing some important policies and principles about the city's philosophy about parking and how much parking the city feels it's important to provide for different types of uses. So there may be some policy statements in the general plan about parking broadly, but they're unlikely to get to the level, again, based on my experience with other general plans, unlikely to get to the level of providing very specific parking standards or ratios for a given type of development.
Which of the three land use options is most likely to slow down the rise in rents and home prices?
It's a great question, and it's very material to the general plan update. And we did take a look at this in particular when there's a section of the alternatives evaluation, as I mentioned, that talks about equity and displacement, because that's a big concern that we've heard from a lot of people in San Mateo, both people who feel that they right now are at risk of being displaced from their home in San Mateo because they can't afford to stay there, and their neighbors who don't want to lose these important members of the community. So we know it's very important, and we know it's also a very complex situation. There's a lot of different factors that influence the cost of housing and whether or not someone can afford that cost of housing. In general, as planners, we believe that providing more housing is going to be most likely to decrease the upward pressure on housing prices and make it more feasible for folks to stay. And certainly in a place like San Mateo, which has what we call an inclusionary zoning requirement, where a certain amount of new housing is required to be set at an affordable level, that tends to make a bigger difference on secure and stable housing for people in those communities.
It was mentioned that alternative A won't satisfy housing allocation requirements beyond 2031. Has the state actually confirmed that alternative A satisfies allocations before 2031? And related, if alternative A is effectively illegal, or would at least open the city to penalties and legal challenges based on state housing growth requirements, why is it even being considered in this process?
Sure. So the current housing allocation that you're required by law to respond to right now is being addressed in the housing element. And you saw on the schedule slide that I showed earlier that the housing element is actually going to be completed before the general plan update. And we have to identify as part of that housing element sites that can accommodate at least 7,015 units. And we also need to identify what we call a buffer. The city has a little bit of discretion or flexibility on how big of a buffer they choose to include in the housing element. But right now, it's going to be somewhere around 10,000 or 11,000 units, right in that neighborhood. And that, knowing that, helped us calibrate the amount of residential development that we forecast for alternative A. So we do believe that alternative A is consistent with the housing element. And we believe that the housing element is doing the things it needs to do to be certified by the state. You don't have a housing element that has been submitted to the state yet. So it still needs to be drafted, it needs to be completed, and it needs to be submitted to the state. And then the state's going to have to review it and tell the city what needs to change in order for the city to be what's called in compliance and for the state to certify the housing element. So we can't guarantee the outcome of that process because it's really in the state's hands once they review the housing element. But we have done our best to both develop a housing element that we believe can and will be certified by the state, and to make sure that all three of the alternatives, including alternative A, are consistent with that housing element so that they would not endanger the city's certification of the housing element.
All right, a few related questions. Do all cities comply with the state requirement? What if they don't? Will voters decide which alternative to go with? What is the impact of planning for no growth? Won't that be the best average speeds and most fiscally conservative?
Okay, I might have to ask you to repeat some of those. I was distracted thinking about cities that don't have a certified housing element. So I think that's the requirement that you were referring to when you said if cities don't meet the requirements, that's the requirement to have a certified housing element. In the Bay Area, there are 110 cities and counties. Every single one of them right now has a certified housing element. So up until today, There is really not an example in the Bay Area region of a city that does not have a certified housing element and does not meet the state requirements. What happens is that you will be subject to penalties from the state in terms of availability of state funding. Increasingly, we see that funding certainly for affordable housing, but even for things like infrastructure and other state programs is contingent upon having a certified housing element that meets state requirements. And so a jurisdiction that does not meet those requirements is not eligible for some very important and significant chunks of state funding. And I would expect that to continue. There are also cities, every city in the Bay Area is in compliance now, but there are some cities in the Bay Area who have faced lawsuits in order to compel them to get into compliance. So I would anticipate that that could also be a consequence that a city that doesn't meet these requirements might face. And then you ask about doing nothing. Was there something else in there?
Yeah, well, will voters decide which alternative to go with?
Yeah, okay, great. So we're going through this process right now to help identify the preferred scenario by mixing and matching and hearing your input on the alternatives. And we're going to put that all together with what we hear from the General Plan Subcommittee, the Planning Commission, and the City Council in order to craft the preferred scenario. And we're going to package that all up with goals, policies, and actions to touch on some of these other really important topics we've been talking about into a draft general plan. And then that draft general plan is going to be considered by the community and ultimately by your city council and adopted by the city council. So that's how we get from here to an adopted general plan, something that the city council will adopt. And then finally you ask about doing, or someone asked about doing nothing, and would that be preferable? Doing nothing might not increase the number of cars on San Mateo streets, but it also would not increase the supply of housing. And I think we're hearing what we've heard throughout this process is a lot of voices that say, for myself, I live in San Mateo and I don't feel like I can stay here. Or I work here and I would like to be able to live here and I can't live here, or I run a business here and I'm having a really hard time finding employees to work here because they can't live nearby and they don't want to deal with the commute. So those are some of the most pressing challenges that we need to address. And in addition, you heard earlier, a few minutes ago, me talking about the consequences of not adding housing and not meeting the state requirements. Which would also have significant potential impacts for the city, including the city's budget due to the loss of state funding. And with that, Carrie, I want to try to keep us relatively close to our 8 p.m. end time. So it sounds like we probably have more questions that we haven't gotten to yet, and I really thank you for your interest. And so we are going to be sticking around beyond 8 o'clock to continue answering questions for anybody who wants to stay. But for now, I do want a chance for you to let us know what you're thinking about these alternatives. We've shared a lot of information, and we want to give you a chance to react to that. So we're going to go to another interactive poll, and let me share my screen so that I can pull that up for you. So round 2, social pinpoint polling. Again, we're going to show you a slide that has either a QR code or a URL that you can use to access this interactive polling tool. And Ricky is going to put both of these links in the chat so you can grab them from there. We have an English language poll and a Spanish language poll. The Spanish language one has the ESP on the end. Or you can hold your smartphone up to the screen and capture the QR code, and that'll take you straight to the website. So when you get there, you will see that we're going to ask you more questions this time, and a little bit meatier questions about the alternatives evaluation. What ideas from any one of the circulation alternatives do you like? What would you like to see be part of the general plan? So you can mix and match any of the ideas from those alternatives, or if there's a circulation alternative that you like most of it, You can let us know that as well. Same question about the land use alternatives. What ideas from any one of the land use alternatives do you like or do you have concerns about? What should be part of the general plan? Is there one of the land use alternatives that comes closest to being the right direction for San Mateo in your mind? And then finally wanted to just make sure that we also are asking a question and thinking ahead about potential risks and hazards from climate change. What, in your mind, what's the most critical risk from climate change, such as wildfires or flooding or sea level rise, that the general plan should minimize? So you might choose to identify one of the land use or circulation alternatives. You might suggest one alternative, but with specific changes, or you might mix and match elements of any one of the alternatives, whether it's the different qualities of the alternatives or the differences among study areas in the land use alternatives, to let us know what you think. So with that, let me stop sharing. Hopefully everybody's had a chance to navigate to the polling tool. Angelica, how's it looking? Great, we've already got some answers coming in. So again, you can answer these questions multiple times. You can answer 1 to 5 of them, whatever you want. Again, you can choose pieces to mix and match. So folks like the pedestrian friendly downtown. Some people like alternative C, other people like alternative A. Let's see. So do we have I did see a question, do we have enough water for all the alternatives? That's a great question. That is addressed in the alternatives evaluation. That really depends on the city working with an agency called Cal Water, who is the city's water provider and has the role of planning for future water supply in San Mateo. But there's a lot more information in the evaluation about specifically about water demand and future water supply. So let's take a look at some of the circulation ideas and the preferred circulation scenario responses. Ideas that people really are interested in include the walkable downtown, transit connections, pedestrian friendly downtown. New residents should not be able to own cars, improve traffic flow for cars. There's already a lot of congestion. More pedestrian and bike only streets and paths. Folks speaking up in support of circulation alternative C, as well as circulation alternative A, to have as little growth as possible. We should have transit and, can you go back up just a little bit? Thank you. Transit and active transportation first policy. Please build as much protected bike and pedestrian infrastructure as possible, including a pedestrian friendly and walkable El Camino and on-demand rides, especially for seniors. More information regarding mode share and a proportion of travel by bike, ped, transit, that is in the alternatives evaluation. We just don't have time tonight to go into detail about all of the different things in the evaluation, but if you're interested in mode share and percentages on different modes in the future under these scenarios, please check out the evaluation. We did take a look at that. So shifting gears and looking at the land use ideas or land use alternatives, we definitely see a diversity of perspectives. Alternative A, less is more, we are built out. Alternative C for land use is a good start, maybe mixed with B, alternative C. So other folks, again, alternative A is consistent with voters' preference. Alternative A should be discarded. I like land use alternative A because it protects downtown's character of small and medium-sized businesses. On the other hand, other voices speaking up, I'm worried my children won't be able to afford to stay in the Bay Area. Please choose the plan that builds the most homes, alternative C. Optimize for affordable housing. Please choose land use alternative C. We should have mixed use zones with a minimum percentage of housing with bigger density bonuses. We need to legalize subsidized affordable housing in every neighborhood. Not everyone can afford a $2 million home. Other recommendations for alternative C. As a renter household, my family needs as much help as we can get. So thank you again. That renter perspective is an important one for us, and I appreciate you sharing that. Okay, let's look at some critical risks. Sea level rise and flooding of existing neighborhoods is the critical risk. Developers should contribute to funding this mitigation. Sea level rise, water wasted on lawns and golf courses, turning our wonderful city into a cesspool, definitely a hazard. Sea level rise, lots of concerns about sea level rise. Some folks mentioned wildfires. Some people don't necessarily feel like San Mateo can make a difference in terms of climate change. We've talked about the question about water. Critical a risk is that we will not get enough people out of cars. Other people are less concerned about being at risk of wildfires. And just taking another kind of big picture scroll through here. Alternative C for circulation, alternative C for land use, not enough open space or parks in any alternative. We need to do much more to improve this. We didn't talk a lot about that as part of this presentation, but that is something that's touched on in the evaluation. Thank you for that comment. More housing types in all neighborhoods. We need condos, townhomes, and cottage courts. San Mateo companies can provide shuttles for employees to ease congestion. All right, this is great. And again, gives me a really strong impression of the differences in viewpoints here. I think we've seen comments for almost all of the different alternatives, whether it's especially land use alternatives A, B, or C, and additional ideas about land use and transportation that are still coming in. So this is great, very valuable input for us. And I thank you very much for that. We're going to leave that tool up for another few minutes so you can continue to add your responses there, and we will capture those as part of this meeting. It's now just a few moments beyond 8 o'clock. So let me wrap up here with some next steps. And those of you who are ready to get on with your evening are free to go, of course, at any time. We thank you so much for your time. Separate from the tools that you've been using during the workshop tonight, we also have an online survey at strivesanmateo.org that goes into, it provides links directly to the alternatives evaluation. It explains again what the land use alternatives and circulation alternatives are, and then it offers you an opportunity to provide feedback in more depth on those alternatives specifically. So if you'd like to comment, for example, on individual study areas, you can do that using this online tool, or specific features of the alternatives. You can do that using this online tool. You might have friends or neighbors who aren't able to join us at these meetings. We want to hear from them, and I'd love it for you to refer them to strivesanmateo.org and let them know that they can take this survey. The survey is going to be available now through March 7th, so you have over a month to think about this, digest the complete content of the alternatives evaluation. We really just scratched the surface here tonight, and continue to offer your feedback. At any time, if you have questions or comments, you can send those to generalplan@cityofsanmateo.org. I've mentioned a couple times that we're going to be going to the general plan subcommittee. That's a subcommittee made up of members of other existing city council and other city commissions, as well as a school district representative. And they've been guiding our work throughout the general plan process. So we meet with them at important milestones, and we're going to be taking the alternatives evaluation and your feedback to them at upcoming meetings in February and March. These are virtual meetings that are open to the public, and there is a time for public comment on all of these agendas. So please come and share your thoughts there and encourage your friends and neighbors too as well. So meetings for the general plan subcommittee on February 17th and March 3rd in the evening. Then we will go to the Planning Commission on Tuesday, March 22nd. Again, a public meeting with a public comment period. And finally, go to the City Council to ask for their direction on the preferred scenario. And that will happen on Monday, April 18th at 7 p.m. All of these are city meetings, again, that are open to the public. You can get the links on the city's website and also at Strive, sanmateo.org, where you have all of our materials. So finally, you've already been very, very generous tonight with your attention and with your engagement with our questions. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Folks here in San Mateo are consistently engaged and sophisticated and intelligent, and it makes it a very exciting and rewarding place to do this kind of complex planning work. So I have one more ask, which is if you have any feedback for us about this workshop, please take a few minutes to leave us comments. The feedback that we've gotten at prior workshops has really helped us make our meetings and our presentations and our information better and more effective at communicating with you. So your answers really are listened to and do make a difference. And I would love to do better next time if we can. So please let us know how we can improve, what went well, and what suggestions you have. You can use this QR code or this link. Thank you in advance for your time sharing any feedback. And so with that, we're going to stick around for anyone who would like to and keep trying to answer your questions. You can continue to use the chat function if you want. And Zach, do you want to jump in here?
Well, yes, I just wanted to thank everybody for taking the time out of your evening tonight to join us. It was great to have you in attendance, and hopefully you learned a little bit more about where we are in the general plan process, and we look forward to continuing to engage with you as we move forward. We would be happy to stick around. I know we have more questions that we're going to get to, but if you feel like asking a question verbally, please go ahead and raise your hand. It's under the reactions button in the bottom right corner of your screen, and we can engage with you that way. But otherwise, we'll keep moving forward with the questions we've received thus far, and then shoot to wrap up around 8:30. And it does look like we do have a hand raised. So I guess if that individual could, if we were able to call on them or unmute them so they can ask their question.
Hi, I'm unmuted.
Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name's Ryan. I just had a question regarding the assumption that the bicycle and pedestrian plans and improvements identified in city approved plans would be implemented. And my question is, like, when is the assumption that all of those identified improvements would be implemented? Like, what year? And since they're unfunded plans, is there, like, are you thinking about what the funding needs would be, or is that in a different process in order to implement these improvements?
Sure, I can answer the first piece of that about the year assumption. So the general plan and all of our work on the general plan is looking out to a horizon year of 2040, and we kind of use that as an end point. Not everything that most cities plan for in a general plan always comes to pass exactly on schedule, and I think all of us can kind of probably understand why. As Zach said earlier in the meeting, there's a lot of different factors. A lot of this is subject to private property owners and other market conditions that the city doesn't influence. So, but we kind of need something to shoot for, and so we use 2040 for that endpoint. That's going to be the horizon year of the general plan, as we anticipate right now. And so the analysis is all kind of based on an assumption about both the amount of development and the future transportation network that would be in place in 2040. So that's the answer to that piece.
And then following up on what Joanna said, in terms of funding, obviously that each year, each 2-year budget cycle, we are looking at various priorities and making determinations on what needs to move forward. One of the things that we will do after our updated general plan is adopted is go back and revisit all of our other plans, and that will include our bike and pedestrian master plans, and update them as needed to ensure they're fully consistent with or can help support implementation of the elements that we're considering here tonight of our 3 circulation alternatives. But yes, the funding is the key piece there, especially with infrastructure improvements and such as those for bike and pedestrians. So those will be ongoing discussions based on budgetary availability and then setting priorities about where those improvements are most critical. But obviously the goal would be that we are able to implement a substantial amount of that over this 20-year period of the general plan. And then we do have another question. Kareem, if you can unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask that.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I don't know if I missed this or not, but I do remember in the presentation, Joanna, you mentioned there's a percentage of BMR housing or below market rate housing or affordable housing that the city's targeting. What is that percentage?
Zach?
Yes, I can go ahead and answer that. Right now, the city's inclusionary housing requirement for new housing projects is at least 15% of those units should be dedicated as below market rate. In addition to that, there are other pathways forward. Right now, the city is just breaking ground on a new project downtown, Keeper Crossing, which will be an all affordable project, over 200 new units there. But yes, for new market rate projects, the city does have an inclusionary requirement right now of at least 15% of those units should be below market
in the
rate.
past at city council meetings, I've heard city council members express their interest in increasing that percentage to 20%. I know Joe Goethals, when he was mayor, said something like that, or that he wanted to see 20%, and some other council members expressed the same interest or feeling as well. Is there is that just dedicated just to new developments, or you know, what other projects are they looking at? Are they looking at you know, this, you know, mixed plan developments, medium? Is that across the board, or is it just for just residential rather than multi-residential?
The city's inclusionary requirement does affect all housing projects, but really the type of housing projects that are occurring in the city right now are higher density, generally multifamily type of residential projects. There are definitely other options that the city is exploring. We are also moving forward with an affordable housing project. This would be behind where the former Talbot's business used to be, adjacent to the train tracks over between 4th and 5th. So the city is looking at any number of options as ways to increase affordable housing units in the city, as well as missing middle homes where they're affordable by design, so they're market rate, but still more affordable and cost less. So we are looking at all strategies as ways to increase improve affordability around the city.
So, but that inclusionary housing target or percentages right now, it's 15%, but are there any chances that's going to increase?
You know, there's an ongoing discussion as part of the housing element over this next year, and I'm sure that topic will come up and will be discussed further.
Yeah, no, it has been, but yeah, so thank you.
Great. I don't see any other hands raised at this point, so maybe we can go to some of the remaining written questions that we've received.
I know we had one question about clarifying how the preferred scenario can be formulated, whether that's through mixing and matching, and want to reinforce that yes, we absolutely, we anticipate that the preferred scenario is going to be a mix or a blend of ideas from all of the alternatives. or from most of the alternatives. So you don't need to pick one alternative. It's okay if there's not a single one that you like everything about. We don't expect that to be true. We tried to create a range of alternatives, but we also tried to capture a diversity of ideas in those alternatives. So you can and should pick and choose from the alternatives. So when you go online to the survey tool, you'll see that it walks you through a process of going, if you choose to, you can go through the land use alternatives study area by study area. So for study area number 3, which is really around the Hillsdale and Hayward Park Caltrain stations and the Bay Meadows area, you might say that you like alternative A best there. And then when you go to study area 4, which is mostly the downtown area, you might say that you like alternative C there. So you can mix and match different land use alternatives. And when you give us feedback on the circulation alternatives, you can also mix and match ideas there too. So you might like one of the transit improvements from alternative B, but not the entirety of alternative B. And you might kind of suggest blending that with the pedestrian improvements in alternative A to make your own unique new preferred scenario idea. So please do feel free to mix and match and even throw new ideas into the mix if you feel like they're not represented in the range of alternatives. Carrie, do we have other questions lined up?
Yes, some questions about the fiscal analysis. Well, the first question was, where can we find the fiscal analysis? And then, given that alternative B has the most housing that is financially viable, marketable right now, and alternative C has options that may become more viable over 20 years, which alternative brings the most affordable housing soonest?
Yeah, that's a great question. And let me answer the first one first about the fiscal analysis. That you can go to the alternatives evaluation on the strivesanmateo.org website to see more detail about that. That's one of the later sections of the report. So scroll towards the end and you'll find it there. And then in terms of the more housing sooner, I think that's, or more affordable housing sooner. Again, it's such a complex question with so many factors that the city can control and that the city can't control. So for example, even if the general plan designates a site for new housing in both the housing element and the updated general plan, the property owner is not obligated to build housing there. And the city cannot force anyone to build housing on their property unless they choose to. So the city's role is really to designate this land and create the possibility that housing can be built, but then the city doesn't build the housing itself, and the city doesn't compel private property owners to develop their property. So we do have, the market has a large role to play here, and individual property owners have a role to play that makes it pretty impossible to say exactly what would happen under a given alternative one way or the other, to be frank.
Okay, is all this new housing going to pay their fair share of infrastructure? $1 billion is being spent on the wastewater treatment plant. The new buildings need an extra buy-in fee.
Sure, I think it might make sense for the city to speak to just kind of development fees in general and how that's handled at the city.
Yes, all new development definitely pays an impact fee, a fair share fee, so to speak, as they are now adding new demands on our infrastructure, whether it's additional wastewater generated, additional water demands. The wastewater treatment plant does serve communities in beyond just San Mateo, so there's a larger infrastructure in place for how wastewater goes into that and who has funded that. But definitely, all new development does contribute in various ways and impact fees and improvements in their adjacent area to support their additional impacts or additional stress on the system or use of that system when they come home.
Right. Is there any effort being done to make sure the general plan matches up well and with neighbors? Belmont, Burlingame, Foster City. No city is an island.
Yeah, absolutely. We understand that we're not an island, and we can't make decisions for Belmont and Burlingame and our neighbors, but there's a lot of ways in which our futures are entwined, and really important regional and local collaboration that needs to happen. That's certainly happening right now through the housing element. A lot of that work is all 21 jurisdictions in San Mateo County working together to share data and assumptions and strategies to include in the housing element. So there's a lot of coordination, I know, with San Mateo's neighbors that's happening there. And that would certainly be something that we anticipate continuing, especially as we move into the next phase again, and start to look at policies and actions and predicting, what conditions might be in the future in San Mateo. Zach, you can probably say more about this.
I think you covered it very well, actually. I think that's a good summary.
Okay. And just as an aside, I will mention too that, other agencies are very important for us to coordinate with. So for example, in the alternatives evaluation, part of what we did was reach out to local school districts and talk to them about future students that would be generated under these land use alternatives. And we talked with the water agency that I mentioned earlier about the provision of future water supplies in San Mateo. So our neighboring cities are very important, and there's many other kinds of special districts and special agencies, transit agencies, and others that are also really important to the successful implementation of the general plan.
2 questions about the CEQA process. How does the general plan update CEQA analysis overlap with the housing element analysis? And what's the CEQA path for the housing element?
Great question. I think I will let the city answer that because we're not the housing element consultants. So I want to make room for Zach to speak up.
Definitely. So yeah, we just actually earlier this week held the scoping meeting for the general plan updates environmental impact report, and we are looking at the housing element separately since it is on a faster track for adoption. Right, and we're still considering our options as the best path forward. So we'll know more about that in the coming months as we make our final determination on the best course under CEQA as we complete our housing.
Yeah, and just a quick aside for anybody who isn't familiar with these terms, CEQA is an acronym, CEQA, that stands for the California Environmental Quality Act. And that's a state law in California that requires the city or any public agency to publish a document analyzing the potential environmental impacts, both of individual projects, but also of policy documents like the general plan and the housing element. So that's what this question is referring to.
And one other aside to note is, yes, the housing element, the general plan at a program level, we have to look at those larger scale cumulative impacts, but then each project that comes in subsequently will still be evaluated for its more localized impacts. And so there are multiple levels that environmental review occur, both at a program level under a larger document like a housing element or a general plan update, and then more locally and specifically when various developments occur that have been facilitated by these documents.
EMT is important. However, is level of service allowed to be looked at for key intersections and choke points?
Sure. So this question is also kind of alluding to CEQA and environmental review in a way. So there's kind of two answers to the question. Several years ago, the state of California eliminated level of service as a topic that has to be analyzed in an environmental impact report or other types of environmental review documents. And that's because the unintended consequences of identifying decreases in level of service, meaning increases in congestion in a given intersection, meant that a lot of times that was identified as a negative impact against infill projects in particular. So have building, whether that's a new mixed use building or a new multifamily residential building on a site that's already surrounded by existing development and existing traffic, had looked like it had worse impacts than if we go out to a greenfield area and build a new home or a new building out there where there's no cars driving today. And so we can add a bunch of cars without really creating additional congestion at that individual project site. So that was part of the shift of the state to VMT, which is more aligned with other state goals about reducing greenhouse gas emissions and setting very specific quantitative targets for achieving greenhouse gas emissions. So we need people to be driving less, both less trips and not as far. And so infill development and building within the footprint of our existing urbanized areas becomes a very important part of that solution. So the state said that level of service, or LOS, cannot be a criteria that the city looks at in its environmental review documents that identify the potential environmental impacts of a project. However, some cities still do maintain level of service as a standard that they ask an individual project to look at just as an informational item as part of the project review and approval process. And that would be more similar to like if you asked the project to do like a fiscal impact analysis, for example, which is also not required as part of the environmental review process, but can sometimes be asked for by a city if they choose to, as part of the development review process of an individual project. Zach, I don't know if you want to add to that about San Mateo's practices.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, the transition to VMT is still relatively recent, and the use of level of service is something that I think, well, we won't be using as part of our environmental review, will definitely be something we're still looking at as a data point and to help guide decisions when we're looking at the local street network around any given project or within a project area.
Yeah, thank you.
Is the city prioritizing improvements to protect the city, especially existing and new neighborhoods, from rising sea levels to prevent flooding?
That I know we are planning on that, and that is something that definitely takes collaboration with other agencies. I know our public works staff could definitely speak in more articulately, but I know there are definitely efforts underway to look at various measures that we can, whether it's raising levees or otherwise protecting our lower lying communities from the effects of sea level rise, which we do know is happening and could be occurring in the coming decades.
Yeah, and then we've talked a lot about that as part of this presentation, and it's certainly a topic that we know we need to address in the general plan. And in addition to that, as Zach was saying, it's a topic that the city is already acting on right now, even before the general plan gets adopted. Well, we're right at 8:30. Zach, do you want to add any comments here as we wrap up?
Well, I once again just wanted to thank everyone for your participation and your time tonight, and we look forward to further engaging with you. We just one last pitch. If you haven't gotten a chance, please take a few minutes to take a look at our online survey and leave your feedback there. Also, our general plan team is available, so reach out to us. We have contact information on strivesanmateo.org. And so we look forward to engaging with you further, and as we move this process further, hearing more of your feedback and looking forward to having a plan that serves the entire community and provides a blueprint for where we go over the next 20 years. So have a great evening, and I look forward to chatting again and hearing from you more soon.
Thank you so much, everyone. Hope you have a great rest of your evening. We really appreciate your time tonight.